Along the shore, the cloud waves break. The twin suns sink behind the lake. The shadow lengthens in Carcosa. Strange is the night where black stars rise, and strange moons circle through the skies. But stranger still is lost Carcosa, songs that the Hyades shall sing, where flap the tatters of the king, must die unheard in dim Carcosa. Song of my soul, my voice is dead. Die thou unsung, as tears unshed shall dry and die in lost Carcosa.
I'm going to tell you about a book which is unsettling, not because of what it shows us, but because of what it hides from the characters and what it hides from us as the reader. Reading this book feels a little bit like you're walking through a dream. Nothing quite makes sense, and the world is a bizarre reflection of our own, so you're never sure what you're supposed to trust. It's a little bit like a dark version of Alice Through the Looking Glass. You've stepped into this ridiculous place where nothing likes you. When we think about cosmic horror, a lot of us are immediately going to think of H.P. Lovecraft and his ability to scare us in ways that are difficult to understand. But decades before Lovecraft ever put pen to paper, a writer from Brooklyn, New York had moved to Paris, where he wrote a collection of short stories which would be a huge inspiration for cosmic horror in general, and specifically for H.P. Lovecraft. That book was a strange collection of short stories called The King in Yellow. It's difficult to know what inspired Chambers to write these books. Chambers was mostly known for writing romance, and so this was a big departure from anything else he'd ever done. In fact, even in this collection of short stories, he can't resist returning to his roots. Some of the short stories from this book that come in the latter half are what would be described as romance. There's also a kind of war story as well. So I'm just going to be focusing on the first four and what are, in my opinion, the better and more unsettling stories in this book. I'm not going to give any big spoilers. I'm just going to talk about the plot of each of the first four stories, and then I'm going to talk about whether or not I enjoyed them and why. And we're going to be starting off with what is my favorite story in the collection, and it's also the first story, which is The Repairer of Reputations. This is the longest story in the collection of short stories, and I think it's because it needs that little bit of extra time to introduce us to the world in which we're going to be spending time. It's a world where America is a dominant military force, Europe is being divided and subsequently falling apart, and Russia is reaching into Europe and snatching up all of the territory that doesn't belong to it. Can you imagine? So that's the backdrop of the world, and within it, there's been a play written, although it's kind of mysterious and ambiguous who has written this play, but there's a play that exists where if you read it, you will go insane. Between each short story, there's like a little snippet of the play, and so slowly over time we start to get an understanding of what this play is about. It's kind of interesting. It's sometimes difficult to decipher, but I think that's just very common within cosmic horror. You know, the idea is that you're supposed to fear the unknown, so they can never show you the face of the thing you're supposed to be afraid of. The people in this book, especially artists, and I would say that a lot of the main characters in this book are artists and bohemians that live in New York and Paris. They are afraid of this text, but they're also intrigued by it. They want to know the secrets that it contains. What is it? What's the big deal? Why is this sending people insane? When you read this book, you're constantly questioning whether or not the King in Yellow is real. He certainly seems to have real world power, but that could just be mass delusion. He has cult members all over the world, these kind of nefarious characters, some of which who lurk in the shadows, on the fringes of society, and then you've got others who walk among us. And of that latter category, we meet Hildred Castaigne. Hildred is the protagonist of the first short story, and he has recently had a head injury. He fell off of a horse and had a head injury, and this has completely changed his personality. It led to him being institutionalized. He's recently been released, and to the outside world, it seems as though he's made a full recovery. But we, as the reader, have got access to his inner monologue, and we know that this is not the case. This man is not well, whether it's the fact that he's fell off of the horse or that recently he read The King in Yellow. One of these things, or maybe both, has caused him to be deeply disturbed. Under the surface, he has fantasies of an authoritarian America, a powerful, ancient, cosmic monarchy of which he will sit at the top on the throne as the king. And he's not even the most interesting character. One of Hildred's friends, Mr. Wilde, is a very interesting character. He's another person who society at large thinks is insane, and it's never clear whether he is or not. I'll say this, I think out of all the stories, Mr. Wilde is probably my favourite character. He's so memorable. He has given himself the title of the repairer of reputations, and he has a network of people who are in very prominent positions. A lot of them are famous, whether they're famous writers or people in the media or politicians. It's never clear exactly who these people are, but we just know that they are very powerful people. These are the elites in society. They have done things which has led to their being disgraced in some way, and he is the person that they can come to repair their reputations. He's kind of like a fixer. He can manipulate things. He does this through a combination of suggestion, manipulation, threats, blackmail, and so he's able to kind of control society. It really hinges on secrecy. The kind of access to information which he can acquire from his clients as he can kind of pitch them against one another. This is all kind of suggested in the story. We're never given a clear beginning to end narrative, but he can basically have very powerful men come to him on their knees begging for help, and that makes him in turn very powerful. And it just so happens that Mr. Wilde has very big plans for our protagonist, Hildred Castaigne. The next story in The King in Yellow is The Mask, and where the repairer of reputations is a little bit longer and feels raw and gritty. You know, it's something that you can imagine happening in the real world. The Mask is much more brief and has more of a dreamlike quality to it. This story starts with another short snippet from the play The King in Yellow, and then we're introduced to a bunch of artists and bohemians all living together in Paris, and this is set in a time just before The King in Yellow has been banned in Paris. It's a little bit confusing because the book is called The King in Yellow, but the play is called The King in Yellow. So this book was never banned in Paris, but in this world, the play of The King in Yellow has been banned in a fictionalized version of Paris, which when this was written was set in the future, but is actually set in our past. So, you know, you get it, you're smart. The main character is named Alec, and he's friends with a alchemist slash artist slash sculptor named Boris, and he has created this new chemical which can turn any living thing into flawless marble. So if you imagine, say he's got a rose and he dips the rose into the chemical, what he's going to pull out is a perfect marble rose. He's a sculptor, right? So he's going to keep it secret, and it looks as though he's creating these perfect sculptures, and it's taken him 1 second to do. And so this is really good for business. He's filled an entire pool with this stuff. He's asking for trouble, isn't he? The group of friends, the group of artists are all exposed to the King in Yellow, and I'll just leave it there. I'm not going to spoil anything. I'll say that this short story is a little bit different to the first one because there's a bit more of a kind of light at the end of the tunnel, and that's not to spoil anything. I'm just saying that for most of these stories, there is an overwhelming sense of dread, and there's just a little redemptive quality to this story. The next story is The Court of the Dragon. This one is very short. The next story is The Court of the Dragon, and I think this story is the shortest story in the whole book. Very, very brief. We meet a struggling artist who has recently read The King in Yellow, silly boy, and since then he has had an overwhelming sense of paranoia. And we find him sitting in a church and praying to God. As he prays to God, he listens to the organ player and looks over to him, and it seems as though the organ player is maybe looking back at him, specifically staring at him in the middle of a full church. It's very unusual, very strange. Or is he just being paranoid? Is it his paranoia? Or should he feel the way that he feels right now? Just because you're paranoid doesn't mean that everyone doesn't want to get you. Right? And then finally, we have The Yellow Sign. I would say where the last story had probably the most shocking ending, this story is maybe the most unsettling. It might be The Repairer of Reputations, though. That one was really fantastic as well. This one is set in New York, and the protagonist is Mr. Scott. The good thing about this is that Mr. Scott has actually been present in 2 of the first 3 stories. So this is a recurring character where now he gets his opportunity to be the protagonist. He's a painter. So as I mentioned, a lot of the characters in this are artists. He's a painter, and he has a model come and sit for him while he paints her. Her name is Tessie. You can see the little splashes of Chambers' romance writing here, as Mr. Scott is a kind of hardened cynic. He's seen too much bad in the world, and Tessie is a bright-eyed optimist. And it seems like maybe he's getting won over by Tessie's worldview. The 2 of them are starting to maybe fall for one another. And then one night, Tessie has this horrible dream where she looks out of the window and she can see Mr. Scott being carted through town in a hearse by a man that looks like a maggot. And ever since Tessie had this dream, Mr. Scott has noticed the man outside the church always seems to be staring at him. And he doesn't not look like a maggot. And he does seem to hate him. I'm not going to give any ratings for this video like I usually do. Instead, what I'm going to do, once I've finished this marathon of classic horror, I'm going to rank them all in order of how much I enjoyed them. So if you enjoy those kind of videos, or if you just enjoy books or classic horror in general, make sure to subscribe to the channel because there's going to be a lot more videos coming in the very near future. The King in Yellow was book 4 in my paperback journey across classic horror, and book 5 that I'm going to review next is The Fall of the House of Usher by Edgar Allan Poe. So if you'd like to see my review for The Fall of the House of Usher, then you can click up here. I know that that's pretty relevant at the moment. They got a Netflix show out, so it'll be interesting to compare the two. But yeah, up here, you're going to see the review. Thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Happy reading.